A mother's dignity. The crisp autumn air carried a slight chill as Ms. Lillian Carter stepped out of the grocery store, balancing 2 brown paper bags in her arms. At 72, she had aged gracefully. Her silver-streaked hair neatly pulled back, her warm brown skin marked with the gentle wrinkles of wisdom and time. She hummed a soft melody to herself, a hymn her mother used to sing, as she approached her navy blue sedan parked in a quiet lot near the store entrance. As she placed her bags into the trunk, the faint sound of tires screeching against asphalt made her glance up. A black and white police cruiser had pulled into the lot, its lights flashing but sirens silent. 2 officers, one young and tense, the other older with a hardened expression, stepped out. Her heart skipped a beat. She had lived long enough to know what was coming. The older officer, whose badge read Sergeant Barnes, adjusted his belt and approached. "Ma'am, step away from the vehicle," he ordered, his hand resting on his holstered firearm. Miss Carter turned slowly, keeping her hands visible. "Is there a problem, officer?" Her voice was calm, composed, but not unfamiliar with the weight of these moments. "License and registration." The younger officer, Officer Hale, looked jittery, his eyes flickering toward his partner, as if seeking reassurance. "Of course," she replied, reaching for her purse. But before she could retrieve it, Barnes stepped forward. "Keep your hands where I can see them," he barked. She froze, breathing steadily. Her son had warned her about moments like this. Her son, Commissioner James Carter, the first black police commissioner of the city, had told her to never reach too fast, to never argue, to always comply, because even dignity could get you killed. With slow, deliberate movements, she placed her hands up. "My license is inside my purse. May I retrieve it?" Barnes studied her, then gave a slow nod. "Move slow." She did, but before she could hand him the card, he snatched it from her fingers, glancing at it. "Hale, run it," Barnes said, handing it off to his partner. Hale hesitated before taking it to the squad car, radioing it in. The silence stretched as Barnes continued staring at her, his fingers twitching near his belt. "You live around here?" Barnes asked, his voice laced with skepticism. "I've lived in this city longer than you've been alive, young man," she responded, her tone unwavering. Barnes frowned. "We got a report about a stolen vehicle matching this description." Ms. Carter exhaled, steadying her patience. "Officer, I own this car. It's registered under my name. I have the paperwork inside." Barnes didn't acknowledge her words. Instead, he took a step closer. "Mind if we take a look inside the vehicle?" There was no real choice. Saying no would only escalate things. "Go ahead," she said, stepping aside. Barnes opened the driver's side door and began rummaging through the glove compartment. Meanwhile, Hale returned from the squad car. "Her license is clean," he muttered. Barnes ignored him. Ms. Carter watched as he rifled through her belongings, tossing aside the envelope containing her registration, then unzipping her grocery bag, as if she were smuggling contraband instead of fresh produce. Something in her stomach twisted, not in fear, but in fury. She had seen this before. She had lived through this before, and she was tired of it. "This is unnecessary," she said, her voice still composed but now firmer. "You have what you need. Let me go." Barnes scoffed. "I'll decide when we're done here." That's when she did something she had promised herself she never would. She spoke his name. "You should call Commissioner Carter," she said evenly, watching for the flicker of recognition in their eyes. And she saw it. Hale's posture stiffened, his jaw tightening. Barnes, however, let out a humorless chuckle. "Nice try," Barnes sneered. "You think dropping the commissioner's name is gonna get you out of this?" Miss Carter met his gaze steadily. "I don't need to drop his name. I raised him." Silence. A heavy, thick silence. Hale shifted uncomfortably. Sarge." "Shut up, Hale." Barnes turned back to Miss Carter, his face darkening. You think being the commissioner's mother makes you untouchable. He stepped even closer. Newsflash, lady, you're just another suspect until I say otherwise. That was the last straw. Miss Carter didn't flinch, didn't lower her eyes. Instead, she lifted her chin, speaking with the same authority that had shaped one of the most powerful men in the city. Then you better pray you're right, she said coldly. Because when my son gets here, you'll regret every second of this. Barnes smirked. Yeah. And why's that? The sound of an engine roaring into the lot answered for her. A sleek black SUV pulled up sharply, the doors swinging open almost before the tires stopped rolling. Commissioner James Carter stepped out. The air in the lot shifted. Gone was the boy Miss Carter had raised in church pews and summer camps. Gone was the young man she had sent off to the academy with prayers and warnings. Standing before them was the highest-ranking officer in the city, a man who had built his career commanding rooms full of men who looked just like the officers now trembling before him. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, those cold, steel-like eyes, were locked onto Barnes. "What the hell is going on here?" he asked, his voice smooth but dangerously low. Barnes, suddenly realizing just who he had been dealing with, scrambled for words. Sir, we were just..." "Just what, Sergeant?" Carter interrupted, stepping closer. "Just harassing an elderly woman. Just rifling through her belongings. Just humiliating a law-abiding citizen." Hale took a step back, his face paling. Barnes, however, still clung to his last ounce of arrogance. "Sir, she matched the description of a vehicle involved in..." "Let me stop you right there," Carter said, holding up a hand. "Before you dig yourself an even deeper grave, because I promise you," his voice was now ice, "you don't want to see how deep I can bury you." Barnes opened his mouth, then closed it. The power dynamic had shifted entirely. Hale, swallowing hard, turned to Carter. "Sir, we didn't know who she was." Carter let out a slow, controlled breath. "And that's the problem," he said, "because who she is shouldn't have mattered. You shouldn't treat anyone like this." Miss Carter stood silently behind her son, watching him with both pride and exhaustion. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every mother, father, and child who had been wrongfully targeted. James Carter turned back to Barnes. "You're suspended, effective immediately. Report to Internal Affairs first thing tomorrow." Barnes blanched. "Sir, I said report to IA," Carter snapped. "And if you have any sense left in that thick skull of yours, you'll rethink every decision you've made up to this point." Silence. Defeat. Then, slowly, Barnes nodded. Carter turned to his mother. "Are you okay, Ma?" She exhaled. "I am now." But deep down she knew this was just the beginning. The storm begins. The next morning, the city woke up to a brewing storm. The incident at the grocery store hadn't gone unnoticed. A bystander had recorded the entire exchange between Ms. Lillian Carter and the officers, capturing every word, every insult, every ounce of unnecessary aggression. By the time Commissioner James Carter had arrived and flipped the script, that camera had still been rolling. And now, the footage was everywhere. It had started as a simple upload to social media, a shaky video titled, "Cops Mistreat Commissioner's Mother. Big Mistake." Within hours, it had been shared across every major platform, spreading like wildfire. News outlets picked it up, public figures weighed in, and activists demanded answers. By noon, the hashtag #JusticeForMsCarter was trending nationwide. The police department. Headquarters. Commissioner James Carter sat in the conference room of the police headquarters, his fingers steepled in front of him, his expression unreadable. Across from him sat Police Chief Lawrence Gates, a wiry man with salt and pepper hair and eyes that had seen too much. And beside them, a dozen reporters, cameras rolling, microphones angled toward him, waiting for a statement. The air was thick with tension. James inhaled slowly, steadying himself. This wasn't just a press conference, it was a reckoning. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice smooth but firm. "As many of you are aware, an incident involving my mother and 2 of my officers occurred last night. The actions displayed in that video were unacceptable, unprofessional, and unbecoming of those who are supposed to protect and serve." The murmurs in the room intensified. The reporters leaned in. Chief Gates cleared his throat. "Sergeant Barnes has been placed on immediate suspension pending an internal investigation, and Officer Hale has been reassigned until further notice." That wasn't enough. James could feel it. The disbelief, the anger burning in the room. "Suspension?" a reporter from Channel 7 asked, her voice sharp. "With all due respect, Commissioner, your mother was humiliated, harassed, and searched without cause. If she wasn't related to you, would this case even be getting attention?" James's jaw tightened. She wasn't wrong. "If she weren't my mother, this would have been another story lost in the cycle," he admitted, his voice low but deadly serious. "And that's the problem. This department, our system, has enabled this kind of misconduct for far too long. That ends now." Gasps rippled across the room. Chief Gates subtly shifted in his seat. "Are you saying there will be more disciplinary actions?" another reporter asked. James locked eyes with them. "I'm saying there will be consequences for all officers who act with bias, misconduct, or abuse of power. This department will be held accountable. Because this isn't just about my mother. It's about every person who's been on the receiving end of discrimination in this city." A storm of flashes and clicks erupted as cameras went off, capturing this historic moment. James leaned forward, his voice razor-sharp. "If you wear this badge, you will uphold the values it represents, or you will not wear it at all." The room exploded in noise. The battle had officially begun. The fallout. The city reacts. As the press conference aired across the city, reactions poured in from all sides. Some cheered, some raged, and some plotted in the shadows. At a local diner in Westwood, 3 off-duty officers sat hunched over their breakfast, their moods dark. "This is bullshit," one of them muttered, stabbing at his eggs. "He's making us look like the bad guys. We're out there every damn day risking our necks, and now we're the enemy." Across from him, a larger man, Lieutenant Ray Givens, gritted his teeth. "Commissioner Carter's got the whole city wrapped around his finger now," he growled. "He's playing the hero at our expense." "But Barnes did go too far," the younger officer in the group mumbled. Givens shot him a deadly glare. "That's not the point. The point is, Carter's making an example out of us. And if we don't shut this down, we're next." The younger cop swallowed, suddenly uncomfortable. "We should let this blow over," he muttered. "Besides, he's the commissioner. What can we really do?" Givens smirked darkly. "Oh, there's always something we can do." The threats begin. That night, at 11:57 p.m., a single message appeared in Commissioner Carter's inbox. It was anonymous, and it was a warning. "This isn't over. Walk away, or next time, it won't just be your mother." James stared at the screen, his fingers curling into a fist. He had seen threats like this before. But this time, it was personal. He immediately dialed his chief of security. "I want a full security detail on my mother, around the clock. No exceptions." "Understood, sir," the voice replied. James hung up, exhaling slowly. The game had changed, and he was ready to play. Ms. Carter's determination. Despite the threats, Ms. Lillian Carter refused to hide. The next morning, she stepped out of her home dressed in her finest navy blue church dress with pearl earrings, her hair immaculate, her posture regal. When the security agents stationed at her house offered to escort her, she waved them off. "Child, I've lived through the civil rights movement," she said, shaking her head. "I am not about to let a few cowards in uniforms scare me." She was headed to her weekly book club, a small gathering of retired women who had seen it all, from Jim Crow laws to desegregation to modern-day injustice. As she walked inside the cozy cafe where they met, she was greeted by a round of applause. "Lillian, you're famous now," one of her friends laughed, handing her a newspaper. Right there on the front page was a photo of James at the press conference, the headline bold: "Commissioner Carter declares war on corrupt cops." Miss Carter smiled softly. "It's not war," she murmured. "It's a reckoning." The next move. By the end of the week, the police department's Internal Affairs Division had launched a full-scale investigation into excessive force complaints. And Commissioner Carter? He was preparing his next move. A citywide police reform plan, mandatory bias training, independent civilian review boards, body camera policies with no loopholes, and above all, a zero-tolerance policy for racial profiling. But as Carter stood in his office, studying the proposal on his desk, his phone buzzed again. A new message. And this one had an image attached. It was a photo of his childhood home, taken just hours ago. No words, no threats, just a silent warning. James's grip tightened on the phone. They wanted him to back down, but they had underestimated him. Because James Carter, he wasn't just fighting for his mother anymore. He was fighting for every single person who had ever been targeted, silenced, or ignored. And he wasn't stopping until justice was served. No matter the cost. The enemy within. The tension in the city was palpable. Commissioner James Carter had officially declared war on corruption within the police department, and while many in the public applauded his stance, not everyone was happy. There were whispers in back rooms, threats in the dark, and in the very heart of the police force, where loyalty was supposed to be unshakable, cracks were beginning to show. The warning. James sat in his dimly lit office, staring at the photo that had been sent to his phone the night before, a picture of his childhood home, taken recently. There were no words attached, but the message was clear. "We know where you come from. We know how to hurt you." A soft knock at his door pulled him from his thoughts. His chief of security, Marcus Bishop, entered, closing the door behind him. Bishop was a veteran, ex-military, ex-SWAT, and one of the few men James trusted without question. "You look like hell," Bishop said, dropping into the chair across from him. James rubbed his temples. "I feel like it." Bishop sighed, placing a thick file on the desk. "You need to see this." James opened it, his eyes scanning the pages of intelligence reports. Anonymous donations flowing into certain police union accounts. High-ranking officers suddenly taking extended leaves. Encrypted messages on the department's internal network. And then, the most damning part, a list of names. Cops who were actively working against him. James clenched his jaw. "These are my own men." Bishop nodded grimly. "Not all of them, but enough." James exhaled, leaning back. He had always known that cleaning house wouldn't be easy. But he never expected the rot to go this deep. "You were right," Bishop continued. "This isn't just some fringe group sending threats. This is organized. Someone's pulling strings, Commissioner. Someone inside." James wasn't surprised. The enemy wasn't just outside the walls of his department. The enemy was within. And it was time to smoke them out. Sergeant Barnes makes his move. Suspended. That word had been running through Sergeant Barnes' head like a broken record. Ever since that damn video of him searching Commissioner Carter's mother had gone viral, his career had crumbled. The union wouldn't protect him. The public was calling for his badge and gun. And worst of all, James Carter, the man who was supposed to have his back, had thrown him to the wolves. Barnes sat in the back of a smoky bar, nursing a glass of whiskey, when Lieutenant Ray Givens slid into the booth across from him. Givens was a big name among the old-school cops, the ones who still saw the city as a battleground and themselves as the last line of defense. "Barnes," Givens said, signaling for a drink. "Rough week." Barnes scoffed. "Try the worst week of my damn life." Givens smirked. Then maybe it's time we take the fight to Carter directly. Barnes stiffened. What are you talking about? Givens leaned in. There's a group forming. Real cops. Men who don't answer to the politics, the press, or that traitor commissioner. They're done taking orders from a man who'd rather see us crucified than do the job. Barnes hesitated. And what exactly does this group plan to do? Givens chuckled. We plan to remind Carter that he doesn't run this department. Barnes narrowed his eyes. You're talking about going after him directly, aren't you? Givens took a slow sip of his drink. Let's just say, accidents happen. Barnes was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. The war had officially begun. Miss Carter stands her ground. Despite the threats, despite the growing hostility, Ms. Lillian Carter refused to be afraid. If anything, the fight had only made her more determined. So when reporters lined up outside her home, asking for her response to the growing scandal, she didn't turn them away. Instead, she welcomed them in. Dressed in her finest royal blue church dress, she stood tall in front of the cameras, her voice unwavering. I am a woman who has lived through segregation, discrimination, and oppression, she began. I have seen men fight for their dignity and die for their rights. I have marched in the streets and cast my vote when they said I had no right to. Do you think a few scared little boys in uniforms frighten me now? The reporters fell silent. Miss Carter wasn't done. My son is doing what every police officer should be doing, holding the corrupt accountable. And that terrifies the people who have spent their careers abusing their power. She looked directly into the camera, her voice a quiet storm. Well, let them be afraid. Because this time, we're not backing down. The footage aired nationwide, fueling the fire of a movement that was now unstoppable. The conspiracy deepens. Back at headquarters, James Carter stood over a digital board filled with names, connections, and red strings tying them together. His mother's speech had only made things worse. The police union had issued a formal complaint against him. Anonymous officers were calling into radio shows, denouncing his leadership. And now his own department was turning against him. Bishop entered, looking grim. We just intercepted some messages, he said, handing James a tablet. They're planning something big. James scrolled through the messages, his blood running cold. They weren't just talking about removing him. They were planning it. An ambush, a setup, and it was happening soon. James exhaled sharply. They were desperate now, and desperate men made mistakes. It's time to go on the offensive, James said, his jaw tightening. Bishop smirked. I was hoping you'd say that. A deadly trap. That night, a secret meeting was called in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. Inside, Lieutenant Givens, Sergeant Barnes, and 6 other rogue officers gathered, their faces set with grim determination. We move tomorrow, Givens said. Carter's got a press conference at City Hall. It'll be crowded. Security will be stretched thin. We'll make our move then. Barnes hesitated. What's the plan exactly? Givens grinned darkly. A distraction. Chaos. Something that gets the crowd running. In the confusion, we take the shot. Barnes swallowed. And then what? Givens' eyes gleamed. Then Carter's gone. And we take back our city. A cold silence settled over the room. It was treason. It was murder. And it was happening tomorrow. James Carter's last stand. As James read the final intel report on the planned ambush, his heart pounded heavily in his chest. They're making their move, Bishop confirmed. Tomorrow. James nodded. Then he looked up, his eyes filled with calm determination. Then tomorrow, he said, standing up. We end this. The assassination attempt. The morning of the ambush. The sun barely crested over the city skyline as Commissioner James Carter laced up his boots, staring at himself in the bathroom mirror. His face was lined with exhaustion, his sharp brown eyes shadowed from sleepless nights and endless threats. The weight of the moment sat heavy on his shoulders. Today, he wasn't just walking into a press conference. He was walking into a trap. The intelligence reports were clear. Rogue officers within his own department were planning something. Whether it was an attack, an accident, or something worse, he didn't know. But he wasn't backing down. James stepped into the living room, where Marcus Bishop, his head of security, was waiting. The ex-SWAT officer sat at the kitchen counter, loading his pistol. "You're sure about this?" Bishop asked without looking up. "If we move now, we can shut this whole thing down before it happens." James shook his head. "Not yet." Bishop finally looked at him, eyes narrowing. "So what's the plan, boss? Walk into their sights and hope they miss?" James smirked slightly. "No. The plan is to let them think they have the upper hand. Let them make their move. And then we end this. Publicly. Permanently." Bishop exhaled slowly, setting down his gun. "That's a dangerous game, Carter." James nodded once, slipping on his jacket. "It's the only way to win." City Hall. The setup begins. By 10:00 a.m., the plaza in front of City Hall was packed. Hundreds of people had gathered, activists, reporters, city officials, and community members. Banners reading "Justice for All" and "Accountability No" lined the metal barricades. And hidden among the crowd, the enemy. Lieutenant Ray Givens adjusted the cuff of his long-sleeved jacket, concealing the small radio strapped to his wrist. "Positions," he muttered under his breath. A static-filled reply came through his earpiece. "North side. Ready. West rooftop. Got the shot." Givens smirked. Everything was in place. When James Carter took that stage, there would be no coming back. Ms. Carter's warning. Across town, Ms. Lillian Carter sat at her kitchen table, watching the live news coverage of the event. She held her coffee cup tight, her heart restless. She had seen enough in her lifetime to recognize danger before it struck. The way the cameras lingered on the rooftops. The way some men in the crowd stood a little too stiff, their hands too close to their belts. And then she saw him. Sergeant Barnes. He wasn't in uniform, but she recognized the arrogance in his posture. He stood near the edge of the crowd, speaking into a hidden radio. Her stomach dropped. Something was wrong. Without hesitation, she grabbed her phone and dialed her son. The first shot. James stood behind the curtain of the main stage, rolling his shoulders as the mayor finished her opening remarks. His phone buzzed in his pocket. "Mom." He answered immediately. "Ma." "James, listen to me." Her voice was urgent, breathless. "Something's not right." "They're there." James stiffened. "Who?" "The men who want to kill you." Her voice shook. "James, don't go out there." Before he could respond, gunfire ripped through the air. The first crack of a rifle echoed through the plaza, followed by screams of panic. James hit the ground instantly, rolling behind the podium as chaos erupted around him. "Shots fired! Shots fired!" Bishop shouted, drawing his weapon. Another shot, then another. A body hit the ground nearby. A civilian, clutching their shoulder, blood pooling beneath them. James's heart pounded as he assessed the situation. The shots weren't hitting him. They were meant to create panic. This was a distraction, which meant the real threat was closer. The close-range assassin. Through the stampede of bodies, James spotted him. Sergeant Barnes. Barnes wasn't running like the others. He was moving toward him. And in his right hand, a silenced pistol. James barely had time to react. Barnes lunged, shoving past a security agent, weapon rising. But James moved first. He twisted, slamming his elbow into Barnes' wrist, forcing the gun off course. The suppressed pop of a bullet went wide, embedding itself into the stage. Barnes grunted in frustration, trying to fire again. But James was already on him. With a brutal punch, James sent Barnes staggering backward. "Get down, Commissioner," Bishop roared. But James wasn't stopping. This wasn't about running. This was about finishing this. Barnes lunged again, swinging wildly. But James ducked, grabbed his arm, and slammed him into the metal railing. The gun clattered to the ground. James pinned Barnes' arm behind his back, twisting until he heard a sickening pop. Barnes screamed. And then James leaned in, his voice ice-cold. "You thought I wouldn't be ready." Barnes spat blood, eyes burning with rage. "You think this ends with me?" he hissed. "You have no idea what's coming." James didn't flinch. "Neither do you." Then, with one final snap, he knocked Barnes unconscious. Givens escaped. Up on the rooftop, Lieutenant Givens gritted his teeth as he watched Barnes fail. The plan had collapsed. And now, it was time to disappear. He grabbed his duffel bag, stuffing his rifle inside, and moved fast. But just as he reached the fire escape, a voice stopped him cold. "Going somewhere?" Bishop, the security chief, stood with his pistol raised, eyes cold and sharp. Givens hesitated, his mind racing. Then he ran. Bishop fired twice, but Givens was fast, diving onto the next rooftop and vanishing into the city. Bishop cursed, radioing in. "Suspect on the move. We need air support." The aftermath. A city on fire. By the time the chaos settled, dozens of officers had been arrested. Barnes was taken into federal custody, facing attempted murder and conspiracy charges. And James stood on the same stage he had almost been killed on, facing the cameras, refusing to back down. "I will not be intimidated," he said, his voice steady, unwavering. "The corruption within this department will be exposed and eradicated." A roar of applause erupted. But James knew this wasn't over. Givens was still out there. And somewhere, in the dark corners of the city, the real masterminds were watching, waiting. They had failed today, but they wouldn't stop. Neither would James. Because this fight, it was just beginning. The echoes of gunfire still rang in the air as City Hall Plaza descended into chaos. Screams, sirens, and the pounding of feet filled the space where Commissioner James Carter had just survived an attempt on his life. His body still hummed with adrenaline as he stood over Sergeant Barnes' unconscious form, chest heaving from the fight. This wasn't over. Up above, Lieutenant Givens had escaped. The mastermind of this plot was still out there, and James Carter was going to make sure he didn't get far. Chasing the ghost. On the rooftop, Marcus Bishop ran to the edge just in time to see Givens disappear down a fire escape, darting into an alleyway between buildings. "Suspect on the move." Bishop barked into his radio, vaulting over the rooftop ledge to pursue. Down below, Givens ran like a man possessed. He tore through the narrow alley, vaulting over garbage bins, shoving past civilians. His breath came in ragged gasps, his mind racing. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. James Carter was supposed to be dead by now, but Barnes had failed. Now, the entire police department, federal agents, and half the damned city would be hunting him. He had to disappear. Now, the citywide manhunt begins. By the time Bishop reached street level, Givens was gone, vanished into the city. Bishop slammed his fist against the brick wall, rage burning in his veins. "Carter," he barked into his comm. James' voice crackled through his earpiece. "Talk to me." "Givens is gone." He took off on foot, ditched his rifle. "We lost visual." James exhaled sharply, his fury barely contained. "Then we lock the city down. Nobody moves until we find him." Within minutes, an emergency citywide alert went out. BONVA lookout. Rogi Polici Lieutenant, armed and dangerous. Every patrol unit, every FBI team, and every state trooper in the area was mobilized. Roadblocks, checkpoints, helicopters overhead. James Carter wasn't giving this bastard a single inch. The interrogation of Sergeant Barnes. Back at headquarters, Sergeant Barnes sat in an interrogation room, his wrist wrapped in a thick bandage where James had dislocated it. His face was swollen from the fight, but his eyes, they were still filled with defiance. James Carter stepped inside, locking the door behind him. No lawyers, no press, no cameras, just them. Barnes smirked weakly. "Gonna rough me up, Commissioner. Break IA rules." James leaned forward, planting both hands on the cold metal table. "Where is Givens?" Barnes let out a low chuckle. "You think I'm just gonna give him up?" James didn't blink, didn't move, didn't let his fury show. Instead, he just smiled. "You don't have a choice," James said, "because you and I both know you weren't the one pulling the strings." Barnes' smirk twitched. James saw it, the slight hesitation. "There's someone bigger behind this," James continued. "Someone funding you, protecting you. And now that you've failed, they'll throw you to the wolves." Barnes swallowed hard. James pulled a thick file from his jacket pocket and dropped it on the table. Inside, bank records, communications, surveillance footage, proof. Barnes' eyes flickered to the documents. James pressed in. "Talk now, and maybe you make it out of this alive." The surgeon's jaw clenched, his body tensed. And then, in a low, bitter voice, he muttered, "You really think you're gonna win this, Carter?" James didn't even hesitate. "I already have." Barnes exhaled slowly, his confidence breaking. He sat back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. And then, finally, he spoke. "The bigger conspiracy." 2 hours later, James Carter and Marcus Bishop stood in his office, staring at the intel Barnes had spilled. This wasn't just Givens' operation. It was bigger. There was money involved, a powerful faction within the police force and private backers who wanted Carter gone. They had poured resources into keeping a certain kind of law enforcement untouchable, and James Carter was their biggest problem. "They've been working in the shadows for years," Bishop said, flipping through the files. "Bribing officers, burying cases, covering up misconduct." James' fingers tightened around the folder. "And they just declared war," he muttered. Bishop exhaled. "So what's the play?" James turned to him, his jaw set, his eyes cold. "We expose everything." The hunt for Givens. As night fell over the city, James Carter went on the offensive. While his officers combed the streets for Givens, James and Bishop met with federal agents behind closed doors. With Barnes' testimony and hard evidence, they had enough to launch a full-scale investigation into police corruption at the highest levels. But before they could act, an urgent report came in. Suspect LOC88. Givens had been spotted at an old warehouse near the docks. James didn't wait. He grabbed his gun. "Let's finish this." The final confrontation. The warehouse was dark, damp, and silent. James moved quietly, his gun raised, Bishop at his 6. Somewhere inside, Givens was hiding, hunting them just as much as they were hunting him. A noise. James turned just in time to dodge the first attack. Givens lunged from the shadows, swinging a steel pipe. James ducked, countered with a brutal punch to the ribs. Givens grunted but recovered fast, tackling James to the ground. The two men fought like animals, slamming each other against crates, their fists colliding with sickening thuds. Then, Givens reached for his gun. But Bishop was faster. A single shot rang out. Givens froze. Blood bloomed on his shoulder. He collapsed against the wall, wheezing. James wiped blood from his lip, staring down at him. "This is over," James said, his voice like steel. Givens laughed weakly, coughing up blood. "You think this ends with me?" he rasped. James crouched beside him, eyes dark. "No," he admitted, "but it's a damn good start." The fallout. By dawn, Givens was in custody. Barnes had flipped, providing a full confession. And James Carter? He wasn't done yet. With the evidence gathered, he prepared for his next move. A televised statement that would shake the nation. The city thought it had seen a scandal. But James Carter was about to expose the biggest cover-up in police history. And this time, There was no going back. The truth comes out. The dawn of reckoning. The city streets were eerily quiet at dawn. Despite the chaos of the past 48 hours, despite the assassination attempt, despite the capture of Lieutenant Givens, there was an uneasy silence in the air. Because the city knew what was coming. Commissioner James Carter was about to expose the truth. And the people who had been hiding in the shadows for years, they were about to have their day of reckoning. Inside the war room. Inside police headquarters, a makeshift command center had been set up. Screens flickered with live news broadcasts, and the room buzzed with energy. Seated at the center, dressed in a dark suit, was James Carter. At his side, Marcus Bishop, his chief of security, flipped through a thick folder. "You really want to do this live?" Bishop asked. "This could go sideways real fast." James didn't look up, didn't hesitate. "They came for my mother," he said, voice steady. "They came for me. They went after everything I stand for. Now, we go after them." Bishop exhaled sharply, closing the folder. "Then let's burn it all down." James stood up. It was time. The broadcast that changed everything. At 9 a.m. sharp, every major news network cut their regular programming. On screen, the seal of the city police department appeared, followed by a live feed from police headquarters. James Carter stepped forward, adjusting the microphone. And then he spoke. "Good morning," he began. His voice was calm but razor-sharp. "In recent days, this city has witnessed corruption, conspiracy, and attempted murder, all orchestrated by officers within our own police force." The city held its breath. These crimes were not isolated incidents. They were part of a larger system, one designed to protect the powerful at the expense of the people. James paused, his jaw tightening. Today, that system falls. A hush swept through the room. Then, one by one, documents appeared on the screen behind him. Bank records linking corrupt officers to secret slush funds, case files buried by senior officials to protect dirty cops, private communications from within the police department revealing plans to target reform efforts. And finally, the names. A list of officers, politicians, and power brokers who had been pulling the strings for years. The city erupted. Phones started ringing. Offices were shut down. And within minutes, warrants were issued. The fallout begins. As James stepped away from the podium, his phone buzzed. It was Bishop. "You seeing this?" Bishop asked. James looked at the breaking news headlines flashing across the screens. Multiple officers placed on administrative leave. City Council members under investigation. Police union leaders resign amid. "Yeah," James said, his lips curving into a grim smile. "I see it. The backlash." But not everyone was celebrating. The moment the corruption scandal hit, the city was split in two. Some people hailed James Carter as a hero. Others, they saw him as a traitor. By midday, crowds had gathered outside police headquarters, some chanting his name, others calling for his resignation. Inside the station, tensions were even worse. Cops who had once saluted him now whispered in hallways. Some had even walked off the job in protest. And deep inside the prison holding cells, Lieutenant Givens smirked as he watched the news. "They're turning on him," he muttered. Across from him, Sergeant Barnes scoffed. "You think that'll save us?" Barnes asked. Givens leaned back against the cold wall. "It ain't about saving us," he said. "It's about making sure he falls with us." Ms. Carter's warning. At home, Ms. Lillian Carter sat at her kitchen table, watching her son's broadcast replay on TV. Her hands were folded, her face unreadable. And when her phone rang, she already knew who it was. She picked up. "You did good, son," she said softly. James exhaled. "Thanks, Ma. But be careful," she added. "These men you exposed, they won't just take the loss." James was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said finally. Then his door burst open. "Commissioner." Bishop stormed inside, his face pale. James straightened immediately. "What happened?" Bishop threw a file onto his desk. "They just put out a contract on you." James felt his stomach drop. A hit. Bishop nodded grimly. "They want you dead, Carter. And they just put $500,000 on your head. The assassins are coming." By nightfall, James had been moved to a safe house, but even then, he knew it wouldn't stop them. If these people were willing to assassinate him once, they'd try again. Bishop sat across from him, checking his firearm. "So, what now?" James took a slow breath. He looked at the city skyline outside the window, the streets still burning with protest and anger. And then he made his decision. "We don't run," James said. Bishop frowned. "We're being hunted, Carter." James turned to face him. "Then we hunt them first. The war has just begun." Across the city, in a darkened room, a group of high-ranking officials sat in silence. One of them, an older man in a black suit, tapped his fingers against the table. "This Carter situation is getting out of hand," he muttered. Another man, a wealthy political donor, exhaled slowly. "It won't be for much longer." The older man raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" The donor smiled faintly. "We just hired someone," he said. "A specialist." The older man narrowed his eyes. "How soon can he make the hit?" The donor's smile grew wider. "He's already in the city." James Carter's last stand. Back at the safe house, James's phone rang one last time that night. He picked it up, his voice calm. "Carter." A voice, deep and unfamiliar, spoke through the receiver. "I don't know if you've heard of me," the man said, "but I've been paid to put you in the ground." James didn't blink. "Is that so?" he said, his voice cold. The man chuckled. "But I'll give you a choice," the voice continued. "Leave the city. Resign. Walk away." James smirked. "Or what?" The man's tone dropped to a deadly whisper. "Or I'll come find you." James leaned back in his chair. "You're not the first," he said. "Try me." The call went dead. And James Carter knew. The real fight was just beginning. The final battle. The assassin arrives. The night air in the city was thick with tension. A storm was coming, not of rain, but of reckoning. Inside a high-rise hotel on the 23rd floor, a lone figure stood near the window, staring down at the glowing skyline. His name, Mason Voss. A ghost in the world of hired killers, a former military operative, now a ruthless contract assassin, paid for one thing: silencing threats. And tonight, his target was Commissioner James Carter. A sleek silver pistol rested on the table beside him, next to a dossier, James Carter's face staring back at him. Voss flipped through the file, his mind absorbing every detail. Height, 6'2". Background, ex-military, turned law enforcement. Threat level, extreme. Current location, safe house on the outskirts of the city. Final directive, terminate with extreme prejudice. A smirk tugged at Voss's lips. "They should have sent me the first time," he muttered. Then, without hesitation, he zipped up his tactical gear, holstered his weapon, and disappeared into the night. The safe house breach. Inside the safe house, Commissioner Carter sat at the kitchen table, staring at the gun in his hand. His mind was calm, his breath steady. He wasn't just waiting for death. He was ready for it. Across from him, Marcus Bishop was scanning the surveillance monitors. The feeds showed nothing but darkness outside. But both men knew better. "This guy's good," Bishop muttered. "I don't like it." James exhaled. "Then let's not wait for him to make the first move." Bishop smirked. "I like the way you think." Just as Bishop was about to stand, all the lights in the safe house went out. Total darkness. James' grip tightened around his gun. Then, the sound of metal scraping against glass. Someone was inside. Bishop grabbed his rifle, moving toward the hallway in silent precision. James stayed low, his body tense. Then, from the shadows, a single suppressed gunshot. Bishop barely ducked in time, the bullet embedding itself in the wall where his head had been. The fight had begun. Hunting the hunter, James moved fast, sweeping through the darkened safe house. He could hear footsteps, light, precise, calculated. Mason Voss was in the house. But James wasn't about to let a hired killer control the battlefield. He flicked the safety off his pistol, breathing slowly, methodically. Then, in one fluid motion, he flipped the kitchen table over, using it as cover. Another suppressed gunshot, this one barely missing his shoulder. James fired back. The bullet struck glass, shattering a window. Silence followed. James knew what was happening. Voss wasn't running. He was stalking, waiting for an opening. Bishop's voice crackled through James' earpiece. "I'm circling around. Keep him busy." James smirked. "Oh, don't worry. I'm just getting started." He moved carefully, listening for the smallest sound. Then, a whisper of movement behind him. James spun, gun raised. But Voss was already there. A brutal strike from the assassin's knife sliced across James' forearm, making him grunt in pain. James retaliated immediately, landing a bone-crushing elbow to Voss's ribs. The assassin staggered back, but not far. James didn't hesitate. He grabbed a nearby chair and hurled it at Voss. The assassin dodged, rolling into the shadows. James reloaded his pistol. "You're good," he called out, voice even. "But you're not taking me down." A soft chuckle came from the darkness. "You're right," Voss said. "I'm not taking you down." Then suddenly, a detonation. An explosion ripped through the back of the safe house, sending flames and smoke billowing into the air. James shielded his face, feeling the intense heat. Then, in the confusion, Voss was gone. The city's darkest night. James and Bishop escaped the burning safe house, coughing from the smoke. Outside, sirens wailed as fire crews rushed in. Bishop wiped soot from his face, cursing. He rigged the place. He wasn't here to kill you, Carter. He was here to send a message. James gritted his teeth. "Then let's send one back." Bishop's radio buzzed. "Commissioner, we have a problem." James took the radio. "Talk to me." The officer on the other end sounded shaken. "We just got word. There's a full riot breaking out downtown. Someone's feeding the public lies, saying you orchestrated the whole corruption scandal for political power." James closed his eyes for a moment. This was a coordinated attack. Not just on his life, but on his legacy. "They're trying to burn the city down," Bishop muttered. James nodded. "Then let's put out the fire." The final confrontation. The rooftop showdown. The city was in full-blown chaos. Protests turned into riots. Police were under siege. And in the midst of it all, James Carter climbed to the rooftop of an abandoned skyscraper, tracking the only man who could stop this madness. Mason Voss. The assassin stood near the edge of the roof, his gun pointed at James' head. James didn't slow down. He kept walking, stopping only 10 feet away. "This wasn't just about killing me," James said. Voss tilted his head. "No, it was about dismantling everything you built." James clenched his jaw. "Who sent you?" Voss chuckled. "Does it matter?" James exhaled. "No, because I'm taking you down either way." Voss smirked. "Then let's end this." The two men charged at each other. James dodged the first bullet, lunging forward and grabbing Voss' wrist, twisting the gun out of his hand. Voss countered with a sharp knee to James' stomach. James grunted in pain but pushed forward, slamming Voss into a metal beam. They struggled, their fists colliding. Their strength matched. Then James saw his opening. With one brutal move, he hooked Voss's arm, spun him around, and threw him toward the ledge. Voss staggered, one foot slipping over the edge. James grabbed him by the collar, stopping his fall. Voss' eyes widened in shock. "You think I'm gonna let you die easy?" James growled. Voss panted, his grip weakening. James leaned in close. "Tell me who's behind this." Voss hesitated. Then finally, he spoke. "A man named Donovan Pierce," he whispered. "He runs everything." James' eyes darkened. "Good," he said. Then, in one swift motion, James pulled Voss forward and punched him unconscious. The assassin's body collapsed onto the rooftop. James exhaled, staring down at the city. It was far from over, but he had a name. And now, it was time to bring the whole empire down. The war continues. As dawn broke over the city, James Carter stood on the balcony of police headquarters, watching the chaos slowly subside. Bishop stepped beside him. "What's next?" James turned, his eyes burning with determination. "We go after Donovan Pierce." Bishop smirked. "That's a suicide mission." James smiled. "Then I guess it's a good thing I don't die easy." The city wasn't safe yet, but James Carter wasn't done fighting. And the war had only just begun.